I'm going to jump around in this debate because it's a long debate, and you can watch it on Standing for Truth's channel. I'll try to add it to the description of the video. In fact, I'll put it in now in the private or in the comment section, actually. There's the original. That's the original channel, Standing for Truth. It has a lot of debates on there. It's really good. A lot of good stuff on there. So we have Dr. George Antonios. His channel is Counsel and Might. He's a pastor of a Baptist church in Montreal, I believe, Canada. He's from Lebanon, I believe. And he's a dispensationalist Baptist. He is a doctor. So he's written books on the book of Daniel. I'm not a dispensationalist. I strongly disagree with dispensationalism. I really like George Antonios as a person, and I even think he's a good preacher. But I'm basically a works-based heretic, if we're honest, from his perspective, and I don't, their idea of what faith alone is different than me. I'm a Wesleyan Adventist. I'm an Seventh-day Adventist. He's a dispensationalist. Once saved, always saved. I don't believe in once saved, always saved. I think he messes up Daniel really in one of the most profound ways possible. And he's a really smart guy from a dispensationalist point of view. I think he robs Jesus of the 70th week of Daniel and makes it about the Antichrist and puts Jesus' death outside of the appropriate time period, making Jesus fail the prophecy to die with. And it's like, if you're once saved, always saved, and you think Jesus died, paid the wrath of God on the cross, and he has to do it according to the scriptures, like 1 Corinthians 15 says, but you put his death, which is the reconciliation for iniquity, that has to happen in the 70 weeks, and you put his death in the gap of the 70 weeks. Well, now Jesus didn't die within this allotted time period. That's a huge problem, especially for their own position. It seems to me it doesn't work. So again, there's some of my dirty laundry, but I really like George Antonios. I think he's like super smart. He's a nice guy. I think he's a good pastor. I think he has a lot of really smart insight. So there's that. And I kind of agree with him on this debate because I'm not a Calvinist. His opponent, TurretinFan, super smart guy, really nice guy. He's going to agree with me on Daniel's 70th week, sort of covenant theology sort of thing. He understands Israel and the church like I do. They would say we're replacement theology. I would say TurretinFan is kind of replacement theology because of the history. But I'm like, you guys are all replacement theology with your Sunday Sabbath or doing away with the Sabbath, or, it's like the church is Jewish, first off. Yeah, the church is, Jesus, our God, is a Jew. The church was established by Jews for Jews. Every single apostle and disciple of Jesus was a Jew, quote unquote, a Jew, right? A literal descendant of Abraham who was under the curse of the law, first covenant people related to Abraham and the mixed multitude, if you will. And those people established the church, and they kept the Sabbath and the rest of the commandments that you're supposed to keep because it defines sin, which Jesus is saving us from. So, but I'm going to agree with TurretinFan on the sort of the church on supersessionism, I guess is what it technically is called. But I like to give the caveat that it's Jewish. The church is Jewish. If he ain't the Jewish Messiah, he ain't nobody's Messiah. He brought the new covenant to the Jew first. Then that gets sent to the world, including the Sabbath. Sorry to break it to you. Church doesn't get to change the Sabbath. Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath, and Jesus is the God. Made it for man. So I think dispensationalists are the worst offenders, actually, of replacement theology, because they say the church is for the Gentiles. No, it isn't. It's a Jewish church. Established by Jews, for Jews. It's a Jewish church. Jesus is a Jew, and the faith is Jewish. And God only has one plan for humanity, and it's fully realized in Christ already, but not yet. And yes, Jesus will rule on a literal physical temple in Jerusalem after the 1,000 years, in the temple made without hands that comes down out of heaven. So yes, Jesus will be the king of Jewland, Jerusalem, in Jerusalem, from the temple in Jerusalem on the throne of David forever on earth. Will be the capital of the universe, Jerusalem. The Jewish guy who's our Jewish God, who made a Jewish church, will sit on a Jewish throne forever in the capital of Jewland, Jerusalem, forever. So I'm not replacement theology at all. Okay, so here, let's watch the debate. So they're going to be debating on, well, we'll see here. I'll let them say it. But I actually agree with George, but I want to make some interesting, they both did a really good job. I thought George's opening statement was really, really brilliant, actually, but a lot of people didn't like it because it wasn't scriptural enough, but he was well aware of what he was doing. And he got into scripture and he had lots of scripture prepared. I thought it was quite impressive, actually. So let's get into it.
You are going to be working to turn TurretinFan from his position of Calvinism tonight. And TurretinFan, you're going to be trying to pull Dr. George back in. So this should be good. I'm looking forward to seeing what points and arguments you brothers are going to be bringing to the table for tonight's debate. And for those just joining us, this is the great total depravity debate. I'm pumped. But the resolution, here's the specific resolution for tonight. Is grace needed in order to believe the gospel? TurretinFan takes the affirmative. Dr. George Antonios takes the negative. And format-wise, for tonight's exchange, we have a formal debate for everyone. And so we're going to be having 15-minute opening statements. TurretinFan being in the affirmative, he'll be kicking us off with that. Then we're going to have a comprehensive rebuttal. We're going to have 10 minutes each for our debaters to engage each other's points and arguments. Then we're going to jump into cross-examination. So cross-examination is going to be 40 minutes in total, 20 minutes each to lead the way in questions and discussion. Then we'll wrap things up in terms of the main portion of tonight with concluding statements of 7 minutes. Then this is where we get you guys in the audience involved. We'll have a roughly 25-minute audience Q&A. So please, if you do have a question or challenge, you hear something that the debaters are saying tonight, you have an objection to that, send those in, tag me at Standing for Truth, let me know who the question or challenge is for, and we will have some fun engaging your comments. Okay, TurretinFan, we are going to hand it over to you. We are going to get into our opening statements for tonight's exciting debate, guys. I'm looking forward to this. So, Turretin, you just let me know when you're ready, and you're good to go. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much. The topic is grace needed in order to believe the gospel? My answer, of course, is yes. That's why in the affirmative. The roadmap for tonight's discussion. First, I'll present a simple argument. Then I'll answer the question, why doesn't everyone have faith? I'll have a slide about their necessity of light. God's new creation mirrors God's original creation. And what good is light to closed eyes? So we'll talk about opening their eyes. We'll talk about opening Lydia's heart. We'll explain that faith is not of ourselves, and then describe the paradox of unbelief. And hopefully I'll have some time for a few bonus slides as well. We'll see about that. First of all, the argument. We need grace to believe the gospel. There is none righteous, no, not one, Romans 3:10, and all have sinned, Romans 3:23 and Romans 5:12. This is not just a coincidence. It's not just a statistical anomaly that there's this problem of sin in the world. This is because by nature we are children of wrath, Ephesians 2:3. That which is born of the flesh is flesh, John 3:6 tells us, and they that are after the flesh do mind the things of the flesh, Romans 8:5. They that are in the flesh cannot please God, Romans 8:8. But God is rich in mercy, Ephesians 2:4 tells us, and he saves us by grace, Ephesians 2:5 and 8 says. Faith is the instrumental means. It's not the ground of our salvation. It's not a condition we have to do in order to be saved. It's the way by which we take hold of the righteousness of Christ. This faith that we have is not of ourselves. And this is the work of God, that you believe on him whom he has sent, John 6:29 tells us. And then he which has begun a good work in you will perform it until the day of Jesus Christ. So the beginnings of salvation are a work that God does in us so that we believe on him who the Father has sent. The Father draws us to Jesus and we believe and we're saved. That's why we need grace to believe the gospel. We need it because we're by nature children of wrath. We mind the things of the flesh and we cannot please God on our own, but God's rich in mercy and gives us grace whereby we can believe the gospel and be saved. The question, why doesn't everyone have faith? John 3:19 through 20 says, and this is the condemnation that light is come into the world, and men loved darkness rather than light because their deeds were evil. For everyone that does evil hates the light, neither comes to the light, lest his deeds should be reproved. So why is it that people don't come to the light? Well, they hate the light. And this is not just some people. We just saw before, everyone has sinned. We're all by nature children of wrath. This is just the natural state of man. We're in darkness and we hate the light. That's why we won't come to the light. John 3:19 through 20 explains. John 6:44 says, no man can come to me except the Father which has sent me draw him, and I'll raise him up at the last day. So what's needed is grace from God to draw us to Christ. God the Father gives us grace. This is described as drawing us to Christ. And then consequently, we believe and are saved. Now notice this, we'll come back to this in John 8:45, but you see that it says, and because I tell you the truth, you don't believe me. This will create that paradox that we'll talk about later, God willing. And John 10:26, but you believe not because you're not of my sheep, as I said unto you. So it's not like we can just make ourselves sheep before we've even believed in order to believe. And the fact that we're not of Christ's sheep is somehow an explanation for our lack of belief. We'll come back to this if we have time. Let there be light. So 2 Corinthians 4, the light, so that this came from God, neither came I of myself, but he sent me. Why do you not understand my speech?
I think it's one of the more interesting parts. I want to see. You have to define works, Jamie. I understand why some have visceral reactions to works, since there are justification for slavery in that ideology. Yeah, I think I know what you mean. One thing I want to focus in on this debate, I'm going to kind of jump to it. I just want to give you kind of a taste of the sort of the Calvinistic view if you're not familiar with it. Let him speak for himself. I don't want to like give somebody more time, but I wanted to focus in on George. Obviously believes that God gives grace to people so that they can believe. So the wording of the debate, George describes his position, but when they get into the cross-examination and they talk about John 6:44, that's what I wanted to zoom in on. I think I wanted to zoom in where TurretinFan gives up the rest of his time and make a comment on that. And then George's response. And then I want to give my own sort of thoughts on that. But the debate is I put it in the live stream. If you want to watch the whole debate, you can watch it from the original source. I just wanted to give my commentary on a few parts here. So let me find the part so I can get straight to it.
Speech, even because you can. And it's so, Calvinism so controls academics, Christian academia, it pervades the academic ether that a lot of people who are not even Calvinists have absorbed that. They do think that there's something kind of mystical to faith, like there's saving faith and not saving faith, when faith in the Bible, as I read it, is just mental assent / plus trust. It really is that simple. Typical methodology when dealing with the Bible passages that supposedly support total inability or the need for some kind of Calvinistic grace for men to believe is that verses on the sinfulness of man are brought out, which we would all amen, but they are taken to their logical extreme and then imbued with external connotations. So this is kind of a typical opening that you'll hear over and over again. You know, man is sinful, man is blind, man is children of wrath, etc. As if we would say no to all that. But they're reading something else into the implications that's just not in the text. So verses on the sinfulness of man are brought out. Then you get, verses from John John chapter 6, John chapter 10, John chapter 8, sheep, and you're not of my sheep. No man can come to me unless the Father draw him, and then reclassifying faith as a meritorious work, which is an unjust charge, really. That's kind of where how Calvinism operates to prop itself up. The problem with a lot of those terms and the readings of those passages is that our Calvinist brethren have been primed, as I have been primed. It's a Pavlovian reflex almost. It's like, the classic mentalist trick that points to milk and asks you what color it is, and points to snow and asks you what color it is, and points to blank paper and asks you what color it is, and points to my shirt and asks you what color it is, and then asks you what do cow drink, and you answer milk. And of course you'd be wrong, because cows don't drink milk. To survive, that is, they drink water. But you've been primed to think white, 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 white. That's what has happened with words like sheep or children of wrath. That's what has happened with words like ordained or predestination. There's been a connotation that's external to the text that's been made in the mind, and it is extremely difficult to dissociate that connotation and unlearn it and then reread the text for just what it's saying, because the authors of the Bible were not reading with the Calvinistic controversies in mind, so they're not using lawyerly language so as to close the door on anybody employing the fact that the tenor of the words of a passage may resonate with their theology, thereby viewing it as a confirmation.
I actually think that's a brilliant analogy, because I think obviously if Calvinism isn't right, and it's in its distinctives, that is the way that it reads it, that's different than other Christians that may also be Protestant, believe in righteousness and justification by faith, which George does, even though I don't agree with George either in the way he understands righteousness by faith or justification by faith. But if you believe that you're saved by faith, the classic Protestant view, it doesn't require Calvinism, okay? There's free will Baptists and dispensationalists, and they can be Calvinistic or Baptist Calvinist or high Calvinist or Lutheran or so Adventist or a form of Wesleyan. So there's these weird overlaps, and it's funny because within Adventism, I think because it's not a point of real concern in Adventism, these issues like with the total depravity, I think Adventist theology is technically like what George is describing, where we don't, I think some theologians have said otherwise, so, and I'm not a theologian, but I would say it makes the most sense to me, my point of view. Adventism doesn't really, this where it departs, it really fits better without prevenient grace, which is kind of the Arminian version of it's not Calvinistic, but it's Protestant, it's Arminian, it's Calvinists believe in irresistible grace. Arminians believe in prevenient grace, which is like a needed enabling grace, because man is unable to believe unless God gives prevenient grace, and then man can take that and believe or not. So it like frees up man's ability to believe, which is needed because they agree with Calvinists on total depravity. Now, what do Adventists believe? Well, some Adventists talk kind of like prevenient grace. Other Adventists, I would actually say, it depends on what you mean and what you don't mean by it. If you mean it's a necessity because total depravity, I don't think, for instance, Ellen White actually was pushing for that idea. But you can read things differently from different people, so it's complicated. So it's funny because I think dispensationalists are sort of come out of the same time period as Adventists, and it kind of comes through eschatology and stuff. So it's interesting, sort of the historic development there. But I actually do think that's what's going on with Calvinism. I think he's right. But I thought it was a good analogy. Let me find the spot I'm looking for where they get into that part. I just wanted to play a little bit of his opening statement. Let's see.
In Augustine's position, post-Pelagius
suggesting that it's some kind of one of Pelagius's
context. And the Greeks are seeking the last day. It is written
who they were that believed not and who should betray him. And he said there
to Jesus Christ.
In verse 54.
38. And look at the externality
Oh, I think
Okay,
you're still.
yeah, I'm
you're
ready.
good. You're good.
I'm ready. At one point, I'll have to pause to share the screen. 1 Corinthians chapter 2. How about
Yeah,
this?
We're good
Like
now.
this?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Exposed to content, but receiving that content, and I will bring sackcloth upon all loins.
Reason why I'm saying this to you is because there are some of you that don't believe. That's 64a.
That the Father drawing is
He's referring to the
to me, except the Father drawing.
And so what we'll do is give the floor to TurretinFan for the first 20 minutes to lead the way in cross-examination. Therefore, T-Fan, I'll start the timer on your first question. Go ahead.
Okay, really quickly, I just want to premise. They've both gone and give their opening statements. They're basically arguing over whether or not God has to give grace. It has to do some sort of special work of grace to enable people to believe. And George doesn't even agree with Arminianism here. He's like taking what they would call like semi-Pelagian view, but I think that's silly or whatever. But it's like, so it's going to zoom in on John 6:44. No one can come to me unless the Father draws him, and I will raise him up on the last day. Okay. And so TurretinFan's going to start questioning him before they switch back over. They're now cross-examining. And so TurretinFan is saying, look, people are unable to believe unless God makes it happen. And if God has chosen the people that he does, and he grants them the ability, then those ones come and they're saved. No one can come unless the Father draws. All that come to me, and no one can come to me unless the Father draws it. All that come to me, and I will raise it up on the last day, something like that. But so it sounds kind of like, well, only ones that come are the ones that God makes to come by drawing them, and the ones that are drawn to him are raised up on the last day. Or the ones that are drawn are raised up on the last day, you could say. I think that's the same thing. The ones that are drawn are the ones that come. And those ones take the antecedent and I will raise him up on the last day. Who's the him? Is it the one drawn or the one who comes? Doesn't matter. It's both. It's both, because they're both the same thing. And so I tend to agree. I take the Calvinist exegesis. The only ones at that point in Jesus' ministry that could come to Jesus were the ones drawn by the Father. And the only ones that came, and the only way anybody did come or could come, is if they're drawn. And that drawing is said to be of the Father. And the ones that come are the ones that'll be drawn, and those are the ones Jesus raises up. If you come to Jesus, it's salvation, and you'll be raised up on the last day. And in this right here in the context, they're the only ones that are able to come to Jesus. So now TurretinFan's going to say that proves Calvinism, and he's going to push George on it.
I appreciate you may want to unmute yourself for the cross-exam section. I appreciate the discussion of John chapter 6. I noticed that obviously time's limited, but I didn't hear you get into the statement at verses 64 through 65. And this is in the King James Version, this is what it says. But there are some of you that believe not, for Jesus knew from the beginning who they were that believed not and who should betray him. And he said, therefore said I unto you, that no man can come unto me except it were given unto him of my Father. My question for you is, what is this therefore what does that therefore refer to? Is it connected to 64 or something else?
So I'm just dropping down to the verse to read it. One moment. But there are some of you that believe not, for Jesus knew from the beginning who they were that believed not and who should betray him. So this is Jesus Christ. He said, therefore I say unto you that no man can come unto me except the Father draw him. The Jesus Christ being vindicated in his assertion that if you didn't believe the Old Testament scriptures to begin with, you're not going to believe on Jesus. And here's a case in point, a guy within his own ranks being Judas Iscariot.
So when to my question, which was about the word therefore in verse 65, is that referring to us back to 64 or to some other part of the text?
Well, when he says, therefore said I unto you that no man can come unto me except we're given him unto the Father, he's sending back to verse 44, yeah.
Meaning that when he's referring to the fact that he had previously said that, he's referring to 44.
Yes, sir.
But what does, so that's what, when he says, said I unto you, he means previously I said it back, 20 verses.
Yeah, agreed.
But what is the therefore mean that 65 is explaining something further about 64?
That the Father drawing is the Father giving somebody the ability to come to Christ.
Okay, so one,
not internal ability. Yeah.
Let me pose an explanation, and if you agree with it, great, and if you don't, just so you can explain why it's wrong.
Sure.
So the way I'm reading the 65 is this: he said that he's saying the reason no one can come unto me is that they haven't been given unto Jesus by his Father, and that's the reason that there are some who didn't believe, as mentioned in 64. Is that wrong or right or something else?
You're sending back to verse 39, if I'm not mistaken. This is the Father's will which hath sent me, the all which hath given me. I should lose nothing, but should raise it up again the last day.
Well, I'm reading 65, which says, no one can come unto me except it were given unto him of my Father. And I'm saying that is saying that the explanation for their unbelief is that they were not given unto Jesus by his Father.
That you run that by me again, please, Francis.
So verse.
Do you see the contention? TurretinFan saying, look, no one can believe. They don't believe. No one can believe. That's what the text is saying. Like, when you look at it, he's saying, let me pull it up. He's saying, he's really focused on 65 here in John 6. It really starts back in 30s. Well, the context goes back into John 5, and I would say from the beginning of the book of John, and then you could take that into the Old Testament about this being predicted, the circumstances being predicted, and you can pause at why that is. There's other debates you can watch James White and Leighton Flowers debate it. It was a pretty good one. He's saying, though, that some of you don't believe. And Jesus knew which ones didn't from the beginning, which ones didn't believe, and that they would betray him. And he said, look, then Jesus says to them, therefore, which is therefore, is connecting it to the last thought. The explanation to what was just said, that some of them believe not, and he knows who they are. And now here's the explanation. It's because I said to you that no one can come to me unless it's been granted to him by the Father. So isn't this the reason they don't come? No one can come. They're unable. They don't know who he is, except for the ones who Jesus knows. Says here, he knows the ones that don't believe, and he knows why they don't believe. Why is it? Because, like I said before, no one can come unless it's granted by the Father. See, we have here, everyone's totally depraved. If this is a condition of mankind, right? If this is a description of mankind's condition, that's kind of the way the Calvinist is reading this. Jesus is declaring a sort of a issue with mankind in general, or not in general, well, in general, or just ubiquitously across it's in Adam, Romans 5 sort of thing. So like he said before, and then before he said it, he's teaching here that he's directly here is this no one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, and I will raise up on the last day. No one can come unless they're drawn. The word there is effectual, you could say. This happens. It's like when they draw the fish with the net, helco. It's in when they draw the fish in the net and they pull it into the boat, they helco it in. It's describing an action that occurs. So it's effectual. The Father, the reason they come to Jesus is because the Father's drawing them. Like, I would say it's something like my girlfriend's hair, her long hair that I really liked, you know, it was a done deal. I couldn't resist, right? You can't resist. It's irresistible. Simply irresistible, right? And that drawing is the only way they can come, because they're unable to otherwise. No one can come. And those people will be saved. There you have it. Perseverance of the saints, total depravity, irresistible grace. And so obviously Jesus only died for some people, the ones that he chose to be drawn. And that's what's happening here. The ones God chose beforehand are being drawn and enabled, right? It kind of sounds like that's what's happening, right? No one can come unless God brings them to me. And they're going to be saved, the ones that come to me. And then he reiterates it here. Look, I know why you don't really believe in me. It wasn't granted to you by the Father. If it was granted to you by the Father, he would have drug you. The ones that are coming to me and actually believing in me have been enabled because the Father draws them. And they're going to be saved. Okay? That's the contention.
Verse 65 says, and he said, therefore said I unto you, that no man can come unto me except it were given unto him of my Father. And that's the therefore is saying, the reason why I'm saying this to you is because there are some of you that don't believe. That's 64a, but there are some of you that don't believe.
Well, so one of the things I'm concerned is that this negative inference fallacy that, you know, those are given to Christ come to Christ, but that doesn't mean that those aren't given can't also come to Christ.
Okay. Do you think that I'm committing such a fallacy here?
I think so.
How do you see that?
Well, just because the fact that the Father gives some to the Son, which by the way, in John chapter 17, the only group of people that's specifically said about is the apostles. When the Lord says, "Those thou gavest unto me have I kept," so that doesn't mean that somebody who's not given to Jesus can't come either. I wasn't given to Jesus in the way these guys were given to Jesus in the context, which is the giving to Jesus in context is these are Old Testament believers of Moses. Some of them you see they were followers of John the Baptist. And then when John the Baptist says, behold, the Lamb of God which taketh the sin of the world, they actually move from John the Baptist to Jesus Christ. That is an example of God the Father moving people over to Jesus Christ. And now there's some people maybe also that the Father did not give to Jesus in the sense that the Father didn't move them from John the Baptist ministry to Jesus' ministry, but that would not mean they are lost. The converse of that also is that Judas is given according to Jesus Christ himself in John chapter 17, and yet he ends up being lost. So there's a lot of negative inferences being made here that are not necessarily the case. There's some people that the Father doesn't give to the Son and can still be saved because he didn't move absolutely everything.
I have to do this way, but so here's what I realize I think happens in these conversations is the Calvinist is really zoomed in on the text. And to those of us who disagree that here's the thing. The Calvinist is just like what they do with Romans 9, and they may I disagree with them, but I'm not saying it's not. There's a sense where they exegete this passage correctly. it is saying what I described. I think I did a good job describing their view when I was showing the text. I think that's absolutely true. And I don't think George necessarily disagrees with it. But here's the thing. I totally agree with that exegesis, but I actually zoom in on the text more than the Calvinist does, saying in the context. This isn't describing a permanent condition of humans. But it is saying that the only ones that's talking about in context, right? The direct, immediate verse context here. It's a certain point in Jesus' ministry early on. And the only way they can come is if they're drawn by the Father. The question is, what and by what means and for what reason are they drawn? It doesn't say. But it does say, it does in a sense say the only ones that can come and are drawn are the ones being drawn by the Father, and that's by seeing Jesus. And that's the only way they're going to be drawn to Jesus, and it's the only way they are drawn to Jesus. And that is the work of God in those people. And it's the only, if they don't see, if that means that draws them to Jesus doesn't occur in a person, they can't believe in Jesus. And so it is effectual, and it is the only way possible for those people present at that time in Jesus' ministry to come to Jesus. And it is effectual. The ones that see who he is are drawn, and if they don't see who he is, then they're not going to be drawn to him. They won't be drawn to him. And that is fully and utterly the work of the Father. The question just becomes, the Calvinist sees this as talking about the condition. And like, look, we can take the context and then say, okay, now what are the implications to the condition of humanity in general? Because first we have to decide, what is it saying here? And what George is describing is kind of in the same framework of like, okay, well, but what is this? He's like defending the idea that this isn't describing the permanent condition of all humans necessarily, right? But I think you can actually be more direct in your rebuttal and just give it to him. Yeah, the only ones that can come are the ones that are drawn by the Father, period, right? And then say, look, but it's not a permanent condition, and it's just true in this circumstance. And then appeal to your other verses and say, I would say, you're over applying this as a condition to humanity in general, when it's really just a condition of these particular people at this particular point in the ministry of Jesus, which is highly relevant in the greater context of John 5, basically explains that. And I think George actually does go on to explain it better in his rebuttal. But I like the way TurretinFan kind of, I think, got George hooked, caught up a little bit. But I do think George is capable of ends up explaining what this actually means from his point of view, which I think I agree with. But I think he got him a little bit flustered here. Whatever, maybe I'm misunderstanding it, but that's what I think is kind of happening. It's like George is rightfully explaining why this isn't a permanent circumstance, but I would just give it to the Calvinists, because I actually think they're right. It is saying that it's just not it's not to be applied universally for all time and all people necessarily. That's my honest reading. I think the context demonstrates.
Everybody in Israel to the ministry of Jesus.
So your position then is that some people can come unto Jesus, even though that was not given unto them by Jesus' Father.
Correct.
Okay. Well, I will just return the rest of the cross-examination time that I have. I don't know how much is left, but I'll just return it for audience questions later.
Sure. So, but to be clear,
so you got to go watch the debate. I'll put in George gives a good response and he explains his position better. But I think it's funny. I'm curious. I got to ask TurretinFan if I think he was kind of doing the mic drop thing right there. Was he? He's like, I guess I'm done. I'm done here. This is like, if I would have, George, I would have answered that question. I would have say, so you think other people could come? I would say, I would agree with TurretinFan there. But I think George was thinking kind of in the same mindset as the Calvinist, in that, like, he's thinking, is this text talking about the condition of mankind, like permanently or forever? Calvinist is saying, see, this is the only way anyone can ever come to Jesus. and then George is like answering the question, do you think this is a condition of mankind permanently? And he's saying no. But TurretinFan is zoomed in on the text they're looking at and have been talking about. And George is thinking, what about John 6 and John 12 and everything he's about to show in his presentation, where he goes through a bunch of comparative texts that I think were actually quite brilliant, to explain why this isn't a permanent position. But when you're looking at that original text, I think it's better to let the Calvinists have this one, because I think they actually do exegete the text properly by itself. Just, let's talk about this text here. See, no one's like differentiating, but that's what's actually happening. So in other words, Turretin asked a particular question about this text, and George answered as though he's answering it as though, do you believe the Bible's teaching this is a permanent condition in all cases throughout the narrative? And George was saying no to that. But I think the reason TurretinFan's saying like, I'm done here, is because it's like, well, actually TurretinFan's actually right. This text here, by this one here, is saying plainly that there's only one way they can come. And if they're not drawn by that means, which is the Father drawing them, they're unable. It's quite plain actually in both 644 and 665, or both those few verses, but around those two verses. It's quite clear. At that point in Jesus' ministry, the only ones that were able to come and did come was a work of the Father, and it was effectual. And no one else could come. But that's not a permanent. See, George should have said maybe, or that's fine, but he's thinking overall. That's not a permanent condition. But it is true, George, I think. And that's why TurretinFan was like mic drop. And the funny thing is, and I feel bad because I got to stop it here, but watch the video. George does explain his position, so I think George's theology is ultimately right, and TurretinFan shouldn't be applying this condition ubiquitously. And I think Calvin, and just to finish, I'll also say this is how Calvinists, and they think they're doing better exegesis. I think in many cases this is a case where technically it was better exegesis. I think the Calvinist is right in their exegesis. I just don't think it's to be applied as a condition of man permanently. It's not describing it's describing the condition of Jews at that point in Jesus' ministry before his death, for instance. And the means by drawing is they're able to recognize Jesus, which was them having a relationship to the Father, which George was kind of explaining, that same sort of idea. And he does go on to explain in more detail. I would just suggest to non-Calvinists that they are exegeting the text right. It just isn't universal sort of plight of man in general, period. It's talking about Jews who we were told in Deuteronomy that they would be hard-hearted and that God would use that to take the salvation to the Gentiles. That's what this story is telling. And then, of course, the way John 6 then describes it, there's an opening up. And I would argue, obviously, some of the people that probably didn't believe in Jesus right here and were unable and were not being drawn right now in John 6, there's no reason to think they weren't drawn later. I doubt any of the Pharisees were coming to Jesus already at this point. So in that sense, it was the ones who heard the words of Moses and interpreted it right, unlike the Pharisees, which Jesus goes, it's part of the narrative here. So that's my 2 cents.